700 meters beneath the surface, there was nothing but pure darkness. The ROV camera's light barely stretched a few feet forward, and the crew gathered in the control room sat frozen, eyes locked on the monitor. The team had come out here searching for the remains of an ancient vessel, perhaps gold, silver, or some forgotten chapter of history buried beneath the waves. But what the camera revealed turned the entire mission on its head. Enormous stone blocks sat resting on the ocean floor, clearly visible in the footage. Their edges appeared clean and straight. The surfaces looked smooth and level, and the way they were arranged suggested someone had placed them there with intention. The strangest detail of all was that this wasn't gossip or some fuzzy photograph. This was high-definition footage backed up by sonar readings, captured during an actual survey operation carried out under a government contract. For a brief moment, total silence swept through the control room, as though every single person understood that whatever lay down there was not ordinary. The team had set out looking for a shipwreck, but what they discovered changed absolutely everything. Still, the real question wasn't about what had been found. The real question was about how it had ended up there in the first place. To properly understand all of that, we need to step back a little, because the location where this all took place conjures up a very particular image the instant people hear its name: the Bermuda Triangle. This region is understood to be a stretch of the Atlantic Ocean running between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, spanning roughly 500,000 square miles. Over the years, countless stories have swirled around this area. Some claim that ships vanish here without leaving behind a single trace. Others say aircraft disappear from radar without warning, and many link it to some mysterious force that nobody has managed to explain to this day. So, naturally, whenever the words Bermuda Triangle come up, people's minds jump straight to ghosts, extraterrestrials, time portals, and all manner of strange occurrences. But here's something worth keeping in mind. The story being discussed right now is nothing like those old legends or spooky tales written for internet audiences. This isn't based on something a fisherman claimed to witness. This concerns a documented survey mission, one that brought together a professional crew, a government contract, modern equipment, and real recorded data. Their purpose was never to go hunting for mysteries. They had traveled there to investigate old Spanish shipwrecks and potential treasure resting on the ocean floor, which means at the outset, nobody anticipated stumbling onto anything out of the ordinary. The year was 2001. At that point, nobody had the slightest hint that this mission would eventually become one of the most widely discussed stories tied to the Bermuda Triangle. Back then, nobody was thinking about a lost civilization or some riddle concealed beneath the sea. The mission had a perfectly straightforward and well-defined objective: locating the wreckage of old Spanish vessels, ships believed to have gone down centuries earlier, carrying gold, silver, and precious cargo to the bottom of the ocean. Leading the mission was Paulina Zalitsky and her company, Advanced Digital Communications. This was no group of hobbyists or enthusiastic amateurs. These were people with extensive backgrounds in underwater surveys, seafloor mapping, and deep-sea exploration. The expedition also operated under a formal agreement with the Cuban government, which made clear that this wasn't some documentary production or online experiment. Everything was conducted on a professional level. They had a research vessel, sophisticated survey equipment, and most critically, high-grade side-scan sonar technology capable of reading the ocean floor in considerable detail. The plan itself was straightforward: travel to the designated zone, gather data from the seabed, and determine whether any evidence of ancient shipwrecks existed. The opening days were entirely unremarkable. The monitors displayed exactly what missions of this kind typically show: an uneven seabed, layers of sediment, scattered rocks, and occasional natural formations. For the team, this was standard work, spending long hours watching screens, logging data, and pressing on. Nobody felt rushed, because patience is really the most essential tool on expeditions like these. Days went by. A handful of scans produced mildly interesting readings in certain spots, but nothing capable of redirecting the whole mission. The mood aboard the vessel remained relaxed. The crew kept monitoring their instruments, drafting reports, and hoping the next section of seafloor might finally reveal an old wreck. Then, without any warning, everything shifted. Something showed up on the sonar display that nobody had been prepared for. Initially, the team assumed it was probably just a natural rock formation, but after studying it for a few more seconds, they recognized the pattern was wrong. The markings weren't scattered randomly. There were defined lines. The spacing between them appeared almost uniform. The shapes did not look like anything that forms naturally. The operator studied the screen a second time. The vessel's heading was adjusted by a small degree. Another scan was conducted, and the exact same thing came up again. That was the moment the entire atmosphere on board shifted completely. A mission that had been chasing gold and silver just minutes before had now turned all of its focus toward that unidentified shape emerging from the ocean floor. One particular scan brought everything to a standstill, but before getting into what the team observed next, it's worth taking a moment to understand how they were actually seeing any of this. They weren't relying on a simple underwater camera taking photographs. At that kind of depth, a camera alone accomplishes very little. The technology they were relying on was side-scan sonar. To put it simply, side-scan sonar is a method of mapping what lies beneath the ocean's surface. It fires sound waves down through the water and reads the returning echoes to build up an image-like picture of the seafloor. When the surface below is soft, such as mud or loose sediment, more of that sound gets soaked up, and those zones show up darker on the display. By contrast, where the bottom is hard like rock, the sound bounces back much more powerfully, and those areas appear brighter. Typical geological formations beneath the ocean tend to look highly irregular. Certain spots sit higher, others lower, some shapes are fractured, and certain patterns appear rounded. Professionals who have spent years working with this kind of data can usually tell within a matter of minutes what looks naturally formed and what seems out of place. And that was precisely why what showed up on the screen that day grabbed the attention of everyone in the room. At first, several bright patches appeared on the display. Initially, nobody gave them much thought, but then one person noticed the shapes did not look right. There were lines, and those lines appeared almost perfectly parallel to one another. Even the distances between them seemed oddly consistent. Then, on closer inspection, they spotted certain corners that looked almost like right angles. From that point on, the entire professional team snapped to full attention. The sonar technician's first assumption was that it had to be some kind of system malfunction. He repositioned the ship at a different angle and ran another scan. The same image came back. He then adjusted the gain settings to eliminate interference from signals that were either too faint or too strong. The result was still the same. He went further and changed the frequency to get a different response from depth. Nothing shifted. Up to this point, the team still believed the sonar display might be showing some kind of error. But then they spotted something that completely changed the mood in the room. Shadows. At first hearing, that might not sound significant, but for people who have devoted years to reading seafloor data, shadows are among the most powerful indicators you can find. In sonar imaging, shadows do not appear by chance. When sound waves strike an object and cannot continue past it to reach the area behind, a dark zone appears on the screen. That tells you something is rising above the surrounding surface. If the ground beneath is entirely flat, no shadows form. If something is buried below the sediment, shadows do not form either. And when it is only a thin layer of rock, you typically do not see that effect at all. The team turned back to the screen. They began to understand that those shapes were not simply bright marks. Distinct shadows were appearing right behind them. That meant something elevated was sitting down there, something with defined edges that stood above the ocean floor. At that moment, the expressions across the control room began to shift. The sonar technician immediately wondered if it could just be a distortion caused by the angle of approach. The ship's heading was altered once more, and another pass was made over the same location. The same image appeared again. The situation was beginning to feel genuinely serious. The team decided they would draw no conclusions from a single observation. They made a second pass over the area. then a third, a fourth, and a fifth, each time coming from a different direction at a different speed with altered scan settings. Yet all 5 passes produced the same result. Every scan showed the same pattern: identical straight shapes, identical spacing, identical shadows. At this stage, it was hard to blame the equipment because if the system had been giving false readings, the data would have shifted between runs. Instead, the very same picture kept coming back over and over again. After that, the team opened up their reference databases. First, they ran comparisons against known shipwreck profiles. No match. Then, they looked at coral structures. Nothing resembled what they were seeing. They checked it against documented marine geological formations. Still no answer. Gradually, one conclusion was becoming impossible to avoid. Whatever was showing up below had never been recorded in that area before. It resembled no known wreck, no coral formation, and no standard geological feature. ROV mission, descending into the darkness. The decision had now been made. The sonar continued returning the same readings on every pass, and the team understood they could no longer move forward by staring at data alone. If something was genuinely down there, they needed to see it directly. So they took the next step, deploying an ROV to a depth of 700 meters. Every person aboard the vessel understood in that moment that this mission had stopped being a routine survey. 700 meters below the surface sounds manageable when spoken aloud, but the ocean is an entirely different world down there. At that depth, pressure exceeds 70 atmospheres. No person can survive going there directly. And if a machine fails at that depth, there is frequently no way to retrieve it. If the cable snaps, if the camera cuts out, or if a seal gives way, the ROV remains on the ocean floor permanently. There are no second chances down there. That is exactly why the team prepared with such care. First, the ROV's main cable was inspected in full. Every single connection was gone over carefully. Then the power system was tested. The control systems were checked, and every emergency configuration was run through again. Nobody was willing to cut corners because by now they had begun to feel that something extraordinary might be waiting beneath them. After all of that, it was time to switch on the floodlights. At 700 meters below the surface, sunlight simply does not penetrate. Natural light had not touched that place in thousands, perhaps millions of years. The ROV's lights were about to serve as the team's only eyes down there, so every single light got tested. Over and over again. Then the cameras went through calibration. Angles were fine-tuned, the live feed was verified, the recording system got one final check. Once everything was confirmed ready, the instruction came through from the control room: send the ROV down. Gradually, the cable began paying out. For the opening few meters, things appeared perfectly ordinary. A little natural light still filtered through the water. Small fish drifted across the camera's view. The screen had a calm, almost peaceful quality to it, but as the ROV descended further, that light slowly started fading. The world up above quietly fell away. After a while, the water turned to absolute darkness. At that point, only the ROV's floodlights were still visible on the screen. Their bright white beams sliced through the black and pushed ahead. At a depth of 300 meters, the control room had gone completely quiet. No one was talking. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the screen. The machine continued going down. Outside, there was nothing at all except darkness. Tiny floating particles drifted past the camera lens. It had the feeling of slowly crossing into a world that was entirely empty. The cable kept dropping deeper, and then for the very first time, something began showing up at the outer edge of the floodlights. In those first moments, it appeared to simply be the ocean floor, but within the next few seconds, the team realized what they were looking at didn't resemble any normal seabed. It looked like something that had no business being there. First visual confirmation, 680 meters, 690 meters. And finally, the ROV drew close to the bottom. Every person seated in the control room had their eyes locked on the screen without breaking away. Up until that moment, everyone had been expecting the usual underwater landscape. Mud, rocks scattered around, uneven and rough terrain. But the instant the floodlights reached further out ahead, what filled the screen caused the entire room to go completely still for several seconds. First, one large flat surface came into view, then another right alongside it, then a third. Initially, it seemed these might just be ordinary rocks, but within moments, everyone began sensing that something here was off. These surfaces didn't have the broken, irregular character of typical underwater rock formations. The ROV crept a little further forward. Now the edges became sharper and more defined. Straight edges, clean corners that almost appeared to have been precisely cut. Underwater, objects normally look rounded, worn smooth, and irregular over time. But here, the shapes had a strangely deliberate, organized quality. The camera inched in closer. It was now unmistakable that these were not separate individual stones. What appeared instead were enormous rectangular structures, almost like giant blocks. Some seemed arranged in a line. Some had spacing between them that looked nearly equal. And the further the camera traveled, the more powerful the impression became that this was no random patch of ocean floor. The team then began studying the surfaces more carefully, and yet another unusual detail emerged. The surfaces of the blocks appeared remarkably smooth. There were very few traces of the erosion you'd normally expect. There was no heavy coating of mud over them, no thick buildup of sediment, and it didn't appear as though these structures had been lying buried for any great length of time. The ROV dropped just slightly lower, and now the sheer scale of things began registering. These were not small rocks by any measure. Some of the blocks looked so enormous that the ROV itself seemed like a tiny speck beside them. Their edges were distinct, and each surface could be clearly told apart from the next. It looked for all the world as though someone had deliberately placed these massive pieces down there in some kind of deliberate arrangement. The people inside that control room were no longer the same as they had been. Only minutes before, there had been voices and conversation, but now the room had fallen nearly silent. Nothing could be heard except the hum and noise of equipment. Everyone's gaze was on the screen, yet nobody said a word. The sonar technician sat absolutely motionless in his seat. One hand remained resting on the control panel, but it had stopped moving altogether. The look on his face suggested he himself couldn't quite figure out how to process what he was seeing. One crew member edged nearer to the screen. Another had gripped the edge of the console so firmly that the tips of his fingers had gone pale. No one drew any conclusion. No one declared this was a city or the remains of a lost civilization. But the same question was written across every single face. The ROV kept pressing slowly onward. The floodlights went on cutting through the dark, and on the screen, more and more of the same kinds of blocks kept appearing. Some arranged in rows, some separated by equal distances, some so orderly that anyone glancing at them for even a moment might find themselves thinking. By now, the question was no longer whether something was actually down there. The real question had become, was nature capable of producing something like this? Because it happens quite often beneath the sea that things are found which seem man-made at first glance, but ultimately prove to be entirely natural formations. So the team decided that from here on, every possible explanation would be examined one by one. They started with ocean currents. The ocean is never genuinely still. Water is always in motion beneath the surface. Currents that have been flowing for millions upon millions of years can grind down rocks, split them apart, and produce some remarkably strange shapes. Sometimes the sea floor develops patterns that, when viewed from above, can look very much like roads or walls. But this is precisely where the first difficulty arose. Ocean currents don't organize things into order. They disperse them. When something fractures underwater, the fragments typically scatter off in various directions. But what was showing up on the screen was something entirely different. Straight lines, consistent spacing, and patterns that repeated themselves. Then the team shifted its attention to the second possibility: volcanic activity. In many regions around the world, cooled lava can produce strange and unusual formations. In certain areas, rocks can appear so neatly arranged that from a distance they almost resemble walls constructed by human hands. But when the team examined the ROV footage more thoroughly, this theory also failed to hold up completely. Rock surfaces shaped by volcanic activity typically display more signs of fracturing. Their edges tend to be uneven and rough. Yet here, a number of the blocks seemed to have remarkably clean edges. Certain sections looked so precisely straight that people began raising a serious question. Could nature truly produce something like this entirely on its own? After that, a third possibility entered the picture: tectonic forces. Put simply, the movement of the Earth's plates. Under enormous pressure, vast sections of land can crack and give rise to formations that may appear structured or organized. This theory seemed more convincing than the previous ones, but even here, something did not quite add up. Tectonic forces can tear land apart, but they do not arrange it into neat lines. They can generate pressure, yet they do not typically produce equal spacing between formations. So the team pulled out the geological records for that region. The seafloor surrounding western Cuba is generally thought to consist largely of limestone. Limestone is a relatively soft rock that slowly wears away as time passes. Under deep ocean conditions, its surfaces tend to gradually break down and erosion becomes plainly visible. Yet the ROV footage appeared to be telling a completely different story. So what was actually behind all of this? The team kept going back over the data, reviewing it time and time again. Every single theory answered some questions while leaving others wide open. At this point, after everything the team had observed, including the unusual structure, its shape, its location, and the many questions tied to it, the most critical next step was to understand what the experts had to say. And this is precisely where one of the most surprising elements of the whole story emerges. No leading expert came forward and directly stated that yes, this structure had been built by an ancient civilization. But equally, nobody came out and clearly said that no, this was entirely ordinary either. Rather than becoming more straightforward, the mystery only deepened further. First, let us talk about Manuel Itoldvin. He is regarded as a researcher with a close and detailed understanding of marine structures, geology, and natural transformation processes. When he examined these kinds of claims and images, his approach remained extremely measured. He did not leap to any dramatic or sweeping conclusion. His position was that underwater environments can sometimes give rise to formations that appear man-made, but are in fact the product of entirely natural processes. Yet at the same time, something else became apparent. The available data was simply not strong enough to immediately declare that the whole case had a natural explanation. Now, let us turn to Greg Little. His perspective was somewhat different. He argued firmly against making hasty judgments in situations like this one. In his view, if a location repeatedly displays patterns, shapes, or signals that appear abnormal, they should not be brushed aside simply because they fail to align with our existing knowledge. Greg Little emphasized one crucial point above all else: proper investigation. His belief was that any unusual discovery should not be instantly dismissed as a joke or a product of imagination. If the question is significant, then the investigation surrounding it needs to be equally significant. Better scanning equipment, more surveys, additional teams working on the problem. Only through that kind of effort can we genuinely get closer to the truth. And this is the point where the biggest question truly begins to take shape. If it were ever proven in the future that this structure was genuinely not a natural formation, what would that actually mean for us? It would not simply mean that something ancient had been found. It would mean we might need to completely reconsider when human civilization actually began. Could people have been building and doing things long before the period we currently recognize as the start of history? Was there something that slowly vanished over time and became lost? Or is it possible that even now, we still understand very little about what lies hidden beneath the ocean's surface? The opposing theory. The question naturally arises: what if none of this is actually as mysterious as it appears? What if what we are interpreting as an ancient structure or a buried secret is really just nature going about its usual business? The first explanation people tend to raise is geological jointing. It sounds somewhat technical, but in simple terms, inside the Earth, pressure, temperature, water, and the movement of rock continue steadily for thousands and millions of years. Over time, all of these forces working together can cause cracks to form within rocks in specific repeating patterns, and those patterns gradually develop into shapes that can look as though someone deliberately built them. The most striking examples of this can be found across various parts of the world, where natural rock formations appear so straight and evenly proportioned that at first glance it feels as if someone carefully cut and arranged them, but on closer inspection they turn out to be entirely natural. So skeptics argue that perhaps the exact same thing occurred here. Then comes the natural block formation theory. This suggests that beneath the ocean or underground, large rocks can sometimes break apart and settle in ways that make them resemble constructed blocks or walls. And when you observe them from above or scan them from a restricted angle, the human brain automatically begins connecting the dots and finding patterns. That brings us to the third point, sonar illusion. This is a particularly interesting idea. During underwater exploration, sonar technology is frequently used. It does not function like a direct camera. Instead, it builds an image by using sound waves. And here lies the problem. Sonar does not always produce a perfectly sharp or accurate picture. Sometimes, because of angle, distance, water conditions, and the way data gets processed, shapes show up on screen that simply aren't really there. Picture a handful of rocks arranged in a somewhat orderly pattern, and the sonar ends up connecting those shapes together. On the display, they might start resembling roads, walls, or even buildings. But the moment researchers move in closer and take a proper look, the reality can turn out to be something completely different. And this is exactly where one very important name enters the conversation, Robert Ballard. His entire approach has always been refreshingly direct. His position is clear. If a claim is extraordinary, the proof backing it up needs to be just as extraordinary. In other words, if someone is saying a lost civilization has been discovered beneath the ocean, pictures by themselves simply aren't enough. Unusual shapes by themselves aren't enough. Something more solid is required. And this is precisely where the skeptical argument becomes the hardest to argue against. So what exactly was missing? First, samples, meaning not a single rock or piece of material from that location was ever collected and examined in a lab. Second, isotope dating, meaning no scientific testing was ever conducted to establish how old the structure genuinely was. Third, drilling, meaning no deeper investigation was ever undertaken to understand what the layers sitting beneath were actually revealing. And when all three of those things are absent, science simply stops right there. Because science doesn't advance on imagination alone. It moves forward through genuine investigation. Now, think about just one moment. Imagine that whatever was discovered beneath the ocean wasn't natural at all. Imagine someone actually constructed it. Then the next question appears on its own. If human hands built it, when exactly did that happen? Because the biggest obstacle here isn't the structure itself, it's time. And that's precisely what gives this whole story such a deeply mysterious feeling. The depth being discussed, somewhere around 700 meters below the surface, is anything but ordinary. If a place sits that deep today, the question becomes whether this land was ever above water at all. And if it was, how exactly did it end up so far down? This is where the concept of geological sinking enters the picture. Put simply, the Earth never holds still. Over thousands and millions of years, tectonic plates continue shifting. Certain land rises while other land sinks, oceans stretch outward, and mountains push upward. Some people suggest that perhaps this region was once much closer to sea level and gradually moved downward as a result of geological shifts across time. On the surface, that sounds entirely plausible. But the moment you actually begin working out the timeline, the story suddenly becomes far more complicated. If a civilization constructed something yet left behind absolutely no written records, how would anyone ever know about it today? And if that place later disappeared beneath the ocean, its name might never have been preserved in history at all. This is the point where people begin suggesting that perhaps our understanding of the past is incomplete. Perhaps certain chapters have simply been lost forever. So the final question now belongs to you. What do you believe? Was this purely a matter of geology, or could it represent a missing chapter of human history? And if you enjoy videos exploring mysteries, research, and hidden history just like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now so that every new video finds you first.